All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I saw the number of people joining from around the world. Just a few housekeeping items. If you'd like to double click on the slide image, it will optimize for just the first bit of the discussion today. We absolutely want to hear from you. Please ask your questions in the session chat to the right of the screen, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. Again, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Greg Pryor, and I have had the incredible privilege and pleasure to be at Workday for nearly 7 years, working as a senior member of our HR team, cultivating ideas across our customer community, and working with thought leaders like my friend John Boudreau to understand the future of work and the workforce. To frame up a bit of today's discussion with John, I wanted to share a few perspectives that we're seeing across our Workday customers and our colleagues. I was recently leading a session with a number of CHROs from South Africa, and one shared what I thought was this incredibly poignant perspective that I believe really captures today's headlines, as we've heard through today's discussion already. And she said that while we are all in the same storm, each one of us is in very different boats. I really believe that we are experiencing a growing, what I call a COVID chasm. For organizations, the pandemic has created an expanding digital divide between the digitally enabled and the disconnected. For individuals, many of whom were in a position to adapt, but for many, we see a set of disproportionate challenges facing our frontline workers, our younger employees living alone in cities, and our female workers with care responsibilities, as a few examples. The research suggests that lagging organizations still struggling to respond to the crisis need to make bold moves, while leading organizations have a unique opportunity to accelerate their advantage and emerge even stronger. For those leading organizations positioned to move from recovery to reinvent, we're hearing 5 business and talent imperatives that we think about as the ideas for a changing world. Ideas is an acronym, and I want to just maybe quickly take us through each of those 5 before we get to John. Let's begin with the inclusion and belonging of our employees. For so many reasons, we all have a need to be great places to work for all. Unfortunately, for many organizations, their outcomes have not yet met their intentions. In a recent McKinsey report, almost half of the respondents reported not feeling very included in their organization. That same report found that most employees, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, said that they had encountered barriers to a sense of inclusion, and that 39% of respondents say that they have taken their organization's inclusiveness into account when making a career decision. We are seeing the opportunity to use technology to increasingly personalize and curate talent practices and programs that create more inclusive and effective organizations. Let's turn to the idea of digital acceleration that we've heard about so much this morning already. And we really believe that empowers the level of personalization and productivity, as well as performance required in the new normal. While we have digitized information, processes, and practices, we've only begun leveraging the democratization of data with the power of machine learning to automate and elevate human performance. At Workday, we've been applying this technology to predict what skills you have, what learning recommendations could help you grow those skill interests, who would be a great mentor, and what's a next great career move, or which internal gig could help you build desired skills. Several years ago, I joined a number of HR thought leaders at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab, and I personally walked away from that event with 3 incredibly clear imperatives. First, that machine learning was about to dramatically change the nature of work, and that HR needed to play a critical and central role in helping both automate and elevate work and enable the workforce. The second was understanding how to augment and elevate HR's work. And the third was to ensure that our organizations practice responsible AI. Next is what we call enabling experiences. The digitalization and democratization of data enables us to reinvent enabling experiences that improve both work success and satisfaction for both our organizations and our employees. Increasingly, employees will apply their consumer experiences to work, expecting to be surprised and delighted with a learning recommendation, mentoring connection, or short-term internal gig assignment that will help them grow their highest priority skills. They will expect us to proactively enable their performance with alerts, recommendations, and reminders. They will expect us to coach, inform, and enroll them in programs based on their jobs, skills, and experience level. Imagine embedding and extending your best HR expertise into a system and then letting the employee's unique context automatically trigger that enabling experience that helps keep them on the right course. The fourth imperative, again, we've heard that a lot this morning already, is around agility that requires faster cycles of planning, executing, and analyzing our business. To understand and enable our employees' needs, at Workday, we in fact survey our entire workforce every Friday on what we call Feedback Friday. And while there was never a question to safeguard our employees' well-being with remote work, when the pandemic hit, our response was informed by Feedback Friday insights that showed us that, in fact, our home-based workers had been having a slightly better employee experience than our office-based workers for years before the pandemic. Immediately following the move to remote work, we leveraged our Feedback Friday platform to understand and share each team's unique and specific needs directly with their people leader. And we were able to do that practically overnight, giving the digital enablement. Moving forward, we see organizations needing to understand the skills and capabilities of their workforce in order to redeploy workers and become more adaptive organizations. And finally, as my friend, colleague, and boss Ashley mentioned in her opening remarks, the S stands for the skills imperative. We believe that skills or capabilities are the new career currency that activates the first four imperatives. Much the way HTML democratized the world's information through the interoperability of the internet, imagine a human performance markup language, or HPML, enabling the broad interoperability of people and work across talent marketplaces. Imagine understanding what skills people have and want, and then curating that work to them. For example, machine learning could review a patient's healthcare record and predict the healthcare team that has the capabilities and connections with the greatest likelihood to cure that patient. Fortunately, this new world of technology-enabled skill development is coming at the right time to help us address the skill imperative. The World Economic Forum estimates that due to changes in technology and economic drivers, that 42% of jobs will require different skills in the next three years, and that over 1 billion workers will need reskilling by the year 2030. In addition to helping us address the skills shortage, we are optimistic about how the democratization of skills and work matching capabilities will empower a skill-based economy that values skills over degrees, results over roles, and creates opportunity on-ramps for historically disadvantaged talent by valuing what you know over who you know. While it's an incredibly challenging time, I believe that we have, in fact, this once in a generation, if not a once in a lifetime opportunity to empower the future of work and the workforce together. And it's for those reasons that I could not be more pleased to have my friend, John Boudreau, one of the true pioneers in the future of work and talent, join us for this discussion. John is recognized worldwide as one of the leading evidence-based visionaries on the future of work through his breakthrough research on the bridge between work, superior human capital, leadership, and sustainable competitive advantage. Professor Boudreau has published more than 50 books and articles, and his research has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and Business Week. John, thank you for all your leadership, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you as always. That was an impressive introduction.
Well, thank you, my friend. Much of which I learned from you. So I do, what we've heard so far through the broadcast, and I think it's just been incredible, is the acceleration of change and people really asking, so what's next? What do I do about this? This is something that you've been a pioneer and a thought leader and thinking about for many years. Really, what is the future of work and human capital management? Could you maybe start by giving us your perspectives on what effects has the current context had on your views of the future of work?
Thanks, Greg. I agree with you. The presentations so far have been just terrific. And earlier morning presenters have joined us, so I hope I get what they said right, but they can correct me in the chat. I'm fascinated with the general theme of acceleration. I think virtually everybody would say that we've moved perhaps 5 years to 10 years in just the last 9 months. And I think that's absolutely true for work. Now, that's revealed some amazing opportunities, and you and I are going to talk about some of those. It's also revealed some amazing challenges. And I think what we've seen, Greg, is that work really is a crucible through which so many of the social issues that are important now get solved and get determined. Things like equity, things like social justice, things like a sense of purpose, all the things that you mentioned about how a more fluid ecosystem of work and a work system that allows more diversity, more equity, and a more sense of purpose. So I think what we've seen is those issues were always there, and all of the crises we've seen have accelerated them, have illuminated both the challenges and the opportunities, and I'm going to say have given leaders an immense opportunity to accelerate the progress as well as the disruption.
Yeah, no, and again, these are the topics you've been talking about for years, and absolutely. John, in your work you've done, we have both CIOs, CFOs, CHROs here together in this session. You've had a chance to work with all three of those populations very extensively. Before we get into some of the details on the future of work, how do you see these three C-suite leaders coming together in, given the current context and in the future of work?
Again, Greg, great point. And I think what we're seeing with the crises that are evolving is this is not a one function thing. And if leaders choose to address this with one function, then they're going to miss opportunities and they're going to create suboptimal solutions. It is not enough to solve for the financials. It's not enough to solve for the operations. And frankly, it's not enough just to solve for the people issues that all of my colleagues in HR would be dealing with. My colleague Pete Ramstad and I started talking about the need for frameworks that span various disciplines in the organization and that bring each of those perspectives to bear on key issues. And I think that's only more evident now. Just think about what we mean by return to work or work flexibility. Now, do we solve that with a model based on space usage? Do we solve that with a model based on financial cost efficiency? Do we solve that with a model based on legal compliance, based on medical, or based on HR? Well, the answer is all of them. And that means for all of you that are listening, please get on a Zoom call with all of your counterparts in all of the functions and start working on a common language and some common frameworks for making decisions about things like return to work, about employee well-being, about automation, about equity, and about diversity. Those are multifunctional issues, Greg, and not issues that can be solved in silos. Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. And I think, to your point, we've never faced a challenge of this level of significance that has such breadth, and bringing those communities together, helping them work together, bringing them together is more critical than ever. So I'm going to double click a little bit on some of the great work you've done in the past. If you can give us some answers. I'm a big fan of your wonderful book, Reinventing Jobs. That's probably at least 5 or more years old. You were, as always, way ahead of your time. And I appreciate how practical and explicit that you were in really describing what organizations needed to do there. Can you talk about how your vision for the future of work and job reinvention, what does that look like? Well, thanks, Greg. And let me give full credit to this wonderful set of co-authors that I've been privileged to work with. I mentioned my colleague, Pete Ramstad, and then, of course, Robin J. Suthasan at Willis Towers Watson and David Creelman. And we've really been writing, as you said, for probably the last decade, maybe really the last 20 years about some of these issues. And I think the concept that we've come to is that the work ecosystem is what I called in my last blog going to be much more fluid. And that means that it's going to be fluid in terms of things like the organization boundary, which is becoming more permeable. Work can cross your boundary without an employment contract if you let it, for example. It's going to become much more fluid with regard to the way we think about rewards, not just money and benefits and traditional economic rewards, but things like sense of purpose, things like recognition, things like development, as you've mentioned. And then finally, perhaps the one that runs through all of these things, the idea that we'll return to today of deconstruction. The idea that work isn't easily contained in a job, and that the worker isn't easily contained in the label of a job holder. And those themes have really begun to run through all of our work, both talking about how to engage people in ways that go beyond regular full-time employment. That was the book, Lead the Work. And then in Reinventing Jobs, how the combination of people and automation is the key to understanding the future of work and work automation.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I just want to also encourage our audience. I'm monitoring the chat for questions. I absolutely am prepared to monopolize John's time with questions, but more importantly, would love you all to engage. I see some of our good friends like Rick Devine and others are out there and happy to get questions from them. You've talked about, and we're seeing, I think, not a resurgence, but maybe an insurgence of this idea of talent marketplaces. Obviously, we have this just incredible, what I sort of refer to as this COVID CHASM. You have retail workers soon after the pandemic, where you might have an amazing retailer who was seen as non-essential, having 50,000 retail workers, and then you may have an essential workforce like a Walmart or a Target that we thank goodness, to all of their bravery, candidly, and their courageousness for coming to work, for showing up in the workplace during the early days of the pandemic. So incredibly grateful. But all of a sudden, you had this sort of incredible supply on one hand, and maybe this enormous demand. What are some of the things you've been talking about, talent marketplaces, maybe even across companies for quite a while? What are you seeing now? What are you seeing people talk about in this sort of talent, a more flexible talent marketplace?
Well, thanks, Greg. And I think that's right. You mentioned some of the themes in your introduction. So let me step back a little bit and think about what a talent marketplace is. Obviously, as a lot of people pointed out this morning, we've had work for a long, long time, and we've had an industrial model of work for a long, long time. And that talent marketplace tends to work around the idea that a job holds the work, and you look for a job holder that's qualified for the work. So you could call a talent marketplace virtually all of the HR processes we have, from recruiting to development, et cetera. And as I said, they traditionally operate in a way that assumes that the work will be held in a job and the worker can be held in something called a job holder. What talent marketplaces do is something like a freelance platform in a way. If you think about a platform that you might go to for somebody to build a web application, somebody to build a web page, et cetera, what our listeners and may not know is that those kinds of talent platforms actually can bring you a chief financial officer, a chief HR officer, a consultant, a huge project team to get a project done. And so those talent platforms, and I think that's a good word for what we're seeing here, have evolved now to where they're applicable inside companies. So very often when we hear about a talent marketplace now, what it is a company building a kind of freelance platform for its own employees. So the boundary stays the organization, but the platform now contains things like projects. And a manager, rather than waiting to have a job to fill, can put a project on the platform. And that project is a deconstructed part of what might be a larger job, just like it might be in a freelance platform where it might be just a part of a web design. And then on the worker side, the worker also can deconstruct, so to speak. And we can look at the worker, not just in terms of the job they hold or in terms of whether we have another job for them, but we can actually let them apply for a project that might have nothing to do with their job. One of my favorite examples of this was with a media company that created what they called a talent marketplace. Leaders were encouraged to post projects. Workers were encouraged to volunteer for those projects. And of course, as the marketplace works, it learns about the projects, it learns about the workers, and it becomes a repository of data about how all those matches are taking place. My favorite example is, here's a media company, and they put out a project to voice over the trailers for their movies and television shows. And it turns out that one of their accountants, this is a true story, one of their accountants had a great voice for voiceovers. And so you've now got someone who holds the job of accountant doing the project of a voiceover for trailers. I'll let the audience think about what that means for a sense of purpose, what that means for the development of the workforce, et cetera. So I think that these talent marketplaces are a harbinger of the way we're going to see work begin to evolve. That's not to say that there's a lot of work, Greg, that's going to be easily managed within the container, let's call it, the ice cube in a moment, of work in a job and the ice cube of worker in a job holder. But what I'm writing about now is the idea that those ice cubes are melting. And these crises have really accelerated that. When you think about shifting auto parts workers to make a personal protective equipment, well, that's a fluid change in their work. It doesn't mean you have to change everything, but it means they need to take on certain projects to make them compatible with that. Look at how people are creating work from home. We know that they're getting rid of stuff that wasn't productive at the office, and they're adding stuff that they didn't do at the office. And they're getting together and creating collaborative ways of working that don't fit into a job description. So these talent marketplaces, Greg, I think, are evolving to be the harbinger and the place where organizations are experimenting with things like deconstructing the work, deconstructing the worker, and letting work in general be more fluid and more transparent.
Yeah. So John, I'm gonna even double click. We got a good question from Jason Devereaux on the line here related to skills, but I'll at least speak for myself. The idea of pivoting, or I found the idea of deconstructing jobs to be pivotal to the entire process. When you pull that thread and you start to say, well, what are I've got a role, but that role does work. How do I start thinking about work in a different way? How do you think about that related to the skills that an individual has seen it? And what role do you think technology is going to play in thinking about this idea of sort of the democratization of skills?
So let me talk about those 2 points. Let's talk about skills and automation, Greg. And I love the emphasis on skills. We've heard it a lot this morning. There's a great deal of attention to upskilling. There's a great deal of attention to the idea of skills as a kind of currency. I think it was about 10 years ago that I wrote about the need for, and the evolution of what I called a Rosetta Stone for work. I think your HTML markup example is probably more current. But the idea is a sort of universal translator. And I think that's the urge that is motivating the attention to skills, something that doesn't depend on a job description, but yet is compatible with matching to the work. Now, you and I have talked about this. I noticed that you said skills or capabilities this morning when you introduced this. And as I've written a lot, I think skills are an important and a good example of deconstructing the worker into a language, let's call it skills, that then can be matched to different kinds of work without relying on a traditional job description. In the same way, we can, and I'm going to call that capabilities, because the social scientist in me knows about decades of debate about the definition of skills and other things. But the idea is, yes, just like my example with the voiceover, a person may hold an accounting job, but we need to know if they have the skill to do a voiceover. In the same way, on the other side, we deconstruct work, and that becomes tasks and projects. So it takes some courage, but on the issue of skills, Greg, I think leaders need to begin to imagine, and they need to be calling on their HR leaders to talk about a world where some of their work exists as deconstructed parts. Skills or capabilities on the side of the workers, tasks and projects on the side of the work. Now, we don't have very many systems that can really manage with that kind of a fluid ecosystem. But when you use that fluidity, when you begin to look at these riddles and use that, you can see patterns. And if I may, let me stop there, but I'm happy to now turn to automation in that regard.
Yeah, and John, we're going to have to leave that for a second conversation. Hopefully CNBC will invite us back, and you and I are having this ongoing dialogue. We need to let people get back to the main stage, but first and foremost, again, let me thank you for joining us today. Let me thank you for your, well, actually, I'm getting our producer, Ali, has said I do have time for one more question. So let me ask you, thank you, Ali. Let me ask you, coaching for people. You've been thinking about this for a long time. Maybe for some people, the future of work snuck up on them. What are those two pieces of coaching advice that you would give to our listeners today?
Let me put it in terms of a framework I'm using with my writing now and using with my coaching with executives and organizations. In general, Greg, I think it boils down to this. You need to look for the lessons that you want to sustain that you're learning now. We've talked about a lot of them. Deconstruction, fluid workplace, automation is a combination of people and automation. It is not about just replacing jobs with automation. So find those lessons, figure out the ones you want to sustain, figure out which one of those sustainable ones are in danger of snapping back to something old normal or worse, and then start looking for the places you can highlight those lessons right now, whether it's cross-functional collaboration, whether it's sense of purpose, whether it's fluid work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. Maybe I'll, as we turn it back to the main stage, folks, maybe what I would leave folks with, I do think, to your point, and I've learned this from you, we are at this once in a generation, if not a once in a lifetime opportunity, an opportunity to provide the type of leadership that we all need right now, and how we think about the opportunity to both automate and augment work so that we can elevate those things that are essential human capabilities. And, in the earlier discussion today, we talked about this idea of sort of social agility, that we need these new capabilities in the new reality. And I just want to thank you for all your leadership. If you haven't read John's book, or you don't follow John, please make sure you do that. He's got some tremendous insights. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And you can click on the stage button to the left and return to the main stage. I hope that everyone stays well, and thanks for joining us. Thank you again, John.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Greg.